Okay, I'm getting word that it looks like we're going live. So welcome, good people of Earth, to the Viz 10 lecture series course. And we're going to be hearing an address from, you know, a very, very interesting artist and really kind of important kind of founder of the academic field of computing and the arts today, Joel Slayton. But for the more general audience here, I did want to sort of mention what the class is about, because this is both a public lecture and a lecture to the Viz 10 class. So Viz 10 is a class in the ICAM major and for other students at UC San Diego. The course is a lecture series course. It's intended to have a broad range of scientists, artists, and other thinkers that are relevant to the computing and the arts field come and present to the class. So it's very much a breadth class in the lower division covering issues of our field. And this quarter, we're pursuing a kind of particular theme, which really does in some ways recursively come back onto the field itself. We're hearing about artists and their work, but the artists have all been chosen specially this quarter for their relationship to the computing and the arts field, the ICAM major, and tonight the CADRE major at San Jose State University, which Joel founded. So previous speakers are kind of that who have been kind of old timers in the field so far have been Johnny de Almeida, Cicero Silva. We had our own Amy Alexander and Ricardo Dominguez and Memo Acton present, and also Nassim Nasreen, who is important to us because she's actually the first of our former undergraduates to then go into graduate school somewhere else and come back and address us and actually come back and teach in the department too. So we have this, we're taking a kind of look at the field of computing and the arts through people that are really strongly associated with the ICAM major in one way or another this quarter, including we have 3 more professors to visit with later in the quarter who were once ICAM undergraduates. So we're sort of marking the over 20-year history of ICAM and looking at some of its successful people. And ICAM was preceded by the cadre major at San Jose State, and in fact that turns out to be one of the first kind of formal, intentional, specific programs in computing and the arts at both the MFA and the BFA level in the United States and in the world, really, starting in 1984. So tonight we're going to be meeting an artist, for whom it's really no understatement at all to say is one of the founders of the field, one of the founders of the academic field in particular of computing and the arts. I'll read his formal bio now and then have a few more remarks after that. So Joel Slayton is a pioneering artist, researcher, and curator with over 35 years of experience involving art and technology. His work engages a wide range of practice, including media, installation, and performance, and has been featured in over 200 exhibitions around the world. Joel is Professor Emeritus at San Jose State University, where he was the founding director of the CADRE Laboratory for New Media in 1984. Joel Slayton was the 2019 Stanford Medical School Sterling Visiting Scholar in the Department of Chemical and Systems and Biology. In 2018, Joel curated the last festival, Life, Art, Science, Technology, presented at the SLAC National Accelerator. From 2008 to 2016, Joel Slayton was executive director of the ZERO1 Biennial, an international program celebrating creativity and innovation in the arts held in Silicon Valley. Joel serves on the board of directors at LEONARDO ISAST, the International Society for Arts, Science, and Technology, where he founded and was executive director for the Leonardo MIT Press book series on new media. Since 1999, he has been a senior fellow of the Silicon Valley American Leadership Forum. Joel will be discussing the evolution and influences of the CADRE Laboratory for New Media at San Jose State University, CADRE is an organized research of the university, enabling faculty and students to experiment with digital media and culture. Joel will also share some of his professional activities shaped by the CADRE experience, including that of C5 Corporation, ZERO1, and his new initiative, which by the way, I'm really excited about, the L&J Ranch, exploring land use as it relates to sense of place. And personally, I'm a graduate of the CADRE MFA program, 1999. So Joel was my professor. He was my thesis chairman, and is really an important artist in terms of how I've come to think about art making and the status of art in so many ways. He's also been a collaborator in C5 Corporation, and really important to me is that he's a dear friend. So Joel, I really thank you for taking some time to come visit with my students and with our community. I'm really pleased to introduce you to our community. Welcome to UCSD. You may take the screen, sir.
Brett, thank you so much for that introduction. It was really, really nice. It's great to be part of this prestige series. So I appreciate the invitation, and thanks to everybody at UCSD for organizing this. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so I can just jump into this, okay? And hopefully this all works according to plan. Okay. And there. All right. Are we good? I hope so.
We look good.
Okay, perfect. Well, that's Joel Slayton, that's me. So Brett mentioned that we're going to talk about the CADRE program. So let's begin there. And CADRE began in 1984, and that was a long time ago. Almost 35 years or so. And I just want to be clear about what I'm going to try to do here today, because it's almost impossible to encapsulate 3.5 decades of professional practice in an hour or hour and 15 minutes or so. And probably the best I can do is provide a kind of cursory survey of the initiatives that Brett alluded to. And every one of the slides I'm going to share with you has a story behind it, has a narrative that really should be explored in a much more complex way. It's just we don't really have the time to do that. So I thought for today, especially for this class, the objective to meet would be just sort of to paint a portrait, a kind of trajectory through 3.5 decades of the influence of the CADRE program, both on the field, on on individual people, and on myself in terms of my professional practice. So, we're going to do 3.5 decades and 50 slides. So CADRE began as a conference, actually. It was organized by the San Jose State University Art Department. It was one of the first, if not the first, national conference on art and technology in the nation. And it brought together a host of individuals from around the country in fields of the visual arts, performance, music, installation, design, a variety of fields to sort of gather for a week of activities of both show and tell, but also discourse aimed at opening up the conversation, the larger conversation around this intersection of computing and the arts. And it was out of that I was introduced to San Jose State University. I had been recently relocated to California from the East Coast, from Boston, where I was at MIT prior. I was part of a group called the Visible Language Workshop. It was one of the precursor laboratories that helped and ultimately formed the MIT Media Laboratory. I left in 1980 to come to Silicon Valley in order to sort of shop around the idea of establishing a media lab West Coast. And it was San Jose State University that stepped up to the plate and invited me into the fold, as it were, to begin that process. So I've had an opportunity to work with an incredible range of students over the years, including your very own Brett Stallbaum. And many of these individuals have gone on to shape programs at their respective institutions where they're now leaders. Joe DeLopp, for example, was the first graduate student, MFA graduate student in our program, who is now in Scotland teaching. He's practicing in a whole variety of areas, including installation and sculpture, but also in gaming. He's a games and arts program there, doing amazing work. And Joe was very early in the game, exploring relationships between performance, gaming, interactivity, and networks. Individuals like Anne-Marie Schleiner, who was one of the very first individuals who started to hack video games, in this case, Counter-Strike, in a project called Velvet Strike, which allowed the use the first-person shooter orientation to spray paint graffiti and in the environment of the game. Or Lisa Jevbrot, who is at Santa Barbara, just up the street from you guys, whose early work in net art explored, in this particular instance, a way of representing the entirety of the web in an interactive browser by looking at the IP orientations of the server ownership. And we ran computers in our laboratory 24/7 to reach out across the internet to ping servers to find out what was there. And so Lisa has been very instrumental in building the program at UC Santa Barbara, but was also very, very much a player in the early days of CADRE. Both Anne-Marie and Lisa were selected for the Whitney Biennial based on the work that they did at CADRE. So I wanted to mention early in the conversation here, the model that I brought to San Jose State University in terms of the kind of roadmap that we would pursue. And it was really based on my experience at MIT, which is represented really in that upper graph of the art, science, tech Venn diagram. But part of the reason I left the MIT environment was that it was missing something important. And that's represented in the lower graph, which was this place where the artistic, creative research and experimentation was going to intersect with computing and tech culture. And so that's a place where I felt the arts had a special role to play. And it wasn't in the exclusive of the art, science, tech interfacing, but it was really a complement to it. And it provided a way of thinking about how the arts could be the catalyst for intervening in and provoking new ways of thinking about how computing was going to intersect with culture. And you can kind of look at this overall sort of roadmap and see how the relationships, say, between invention of the future and where it says avenir, that's a mistake up there. It should say something like speculation or future. But that relationship between invention and future, or provocation and innovation, those were important concepts. And I think this model still holds true today. I don't think a lot has changed. It really is a kind of guiding, a guidepost, I think, for where the current cadre program is evolving as we speak. It's important also to sort of look at and to put into context what was going on in 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. The internet as we know it today really didn't exist. The basic protocols for TCP/IP were there, but the web itself was not. And it was the same year that Bell Laboratories went through a divestiture that broke up AT&T into all of its companies. And we're kind of seeing a revisit of that with some of the politics and economics around some of the current large companies like Google and Facebook. It was when Sinclair introduced the first real personal computer that was powerful enough for business applications. It was the year that Apple, when its famous ad at the Super Bowl, introduced the Macintosh computer to the world for the first time. It was the year of the first, HP introduced the first laser printer. Now, all of this stuff seems so antiquated when we reflect back on it, but this was the context that existed for the research and experimentation kind of conceptual focus that laboratories like CADRE were being formulated under, that kind of umbrella. And so all of us saw something really important transpiring, and we knew that the arts had needed to be part of it. And the question really was how to go about the process of putting it together. It was also the year of an X-class solar flare, which is, you probably all know, is the most severe solar flares that can be experienced. So the CADRE Laboratory is really a kind of environment for unlearning. And what I mean by that is that a lot of students come into the environment, whether graduate or undergraduate, and they have matured under traditional art education, modernist rhetoric about the role of the artist and how that artist fits into culture and society. And a good deal of time is spent helping students understand that this intersection with networks and computing and simulation and interactivity and gaming and so on opens up a whole new terrain of thinking about how one interfaces those worlds in an intellectual and in a creative way so as to be able to achieve works that are beyond themselves, that impact the world in more complex ways. And it's not about inventing the future, but it is about speculating about the intervention of and disrupting that future. So the laboratory is a place where community is built, where students learn to learn from one another. And I think that model has survived quite well and is replicated in many places around the world in terms of the approach that is taken in terms of transdisciplinary practice. CADRE also created this really amazing online web journal called Switch, very much in the early days. because we needed a platform for students to interact with the larger international community of artists, scientists, engineers, researchers, cultural experts, to both reach out to them and invite their contributions, their authorship, to do interviews, to feature their own work and the work of others that was challenging the current conception of both where arts and computing practice was situated. And so Switch produced over 20 volumes of online publications, each one designed individually by the students and produced by the students. And it also became part of the community building and collaborative nature of the environment that supported CADRE. And it is a very important piece. Some authors, I mean, I remember one of the first authors that we invited in was Manuel de Landa, the Deleuzian theorist. You know, being able to secure individuals of that stature to participate in this very early experimentation in web publishing was critical. CADRE, therefore, it wasn't just about students, it was about reaching into reaching into that world outside of the university to engage it. It served to be a place where visiting artists wanted to also participate and explore. The net art duo Jody got their start at the CADRE Laboratory. It was where I had the opportunity to invite them in as artists who were working in other media, and they were there and they discovered and were fascinated by the emerging computing technology of the laboratory and began to do the work that they were interested in exploring relative to disruption of the screen image and the web. Obviously, Jody went on to quite international fame in terms of their role in the explosion of net art practice that occurred in that time frame. There is also well-established artists like Antonio Montadas, a CAVS MIT fellow, who had over the years developed a project called On Social Networks, which took on a variety of forms. Antonio collaborated with the students at CADRE to produce this public artwork that tracked the use of military language used in marketing in real time across the internet, and to be able to map that. And this was staged at the San Jose Convention Center, the kind of watering hole for business practice in Silicon Valley. Or this piece by Graham Harwood, Richard Wright, and Matsuko, also known as Mongrel, from the UK, from South London, called Tantalum Memorial, which used what you see there are 6 Stroger switches, which are the original switching devices, mechanical electronic switching devices used for telephone relays that were reconstituted into this interactive sculpture that eavesdropped on telephone conversations in South London, in the Congolese community there, because tantalum is one of the minerals that is used in all cell phones that is mined in Africa and has resulted in major conflicts in the region over the resource management of that mineral. Or Miguel Palma, a Portuguese artist of quite fame that we commissioned to do a portrait of Silicon Valley, who built this rotating turntable with embedded cameras in the scene that would collect the transpiring image as the table rotated to reveal aspects of both Silicon Valley's past, but also the mythology of its future. This is now in the permanent collection of the Arizona State University Art Museum. But that's not where things began. Where things began was here. There's a there's a portrait of me back in 1984 with my colleague Del Coates. Del was one of the designers at in Detroit that was part of the team that developed the old Mustang for Ford. He was an industrial designer at San Jose State, and he and I worked together early on at CADRE. What you see there is posing in front of a Ridge computer, which is the first reduced instruction set Unix computer that was available. It actually fit in the size of that washing machine-like structure, which was a miracle at the time. And this networked into the laboratory to a variety of terminals, which we referred to as the sandbox, where students could interact with a 24-bit frame buffer that was adjacent to this box that was staged in a rack that allowed the students to share that digital image space and to begin to explore computational methods for interacting with the screen to make it do things. And so that was a big deal, because one of the primary notions at CADRE was that students needed to learn to program. They had to learn to code. And of course, we were coding back then in C and in the Unix operating environment, and which was both powerful but also a bit cumbersome compared to today's computing languages. But it allowed us to do things, to explore new methods of data visualization or digital visualization rather, and opened up a whole arena of looking at interactivity and simulation. This is me fooling around with a project that I was working on with my wife, Lisa, on telepresence and using early VR tools to look at how to model a human hand relative to data glove manipulation and interaction with the screen. But the students, were working on a host of a variety of other kinds of programming. Every student in the laboratory was required to do upper division study in some other area of the university. So every student had a custom individualized curricular program unique to them. This is Shona Reed, who was working on very early investigation of using kind of genetic model for creating a video editing software system. So in this system, you could marry clips of video together, and it would develop, it would look at the characteristics of that video and be able to generate secondary clips and so on and so forth to build video. So it was the idea was to automate the entire process of video editing. Early projection mapping work by Cassandra Lehman. She was projecting digital cows. This one is projected at the local Capitol Drive-In movie theater during one of the scenes of Basic Instinct. But she took her projected mapped cow all over the San Francisco Bay Area and projected it into different environments where it was activated. But this maybe seems a little corny in retrospect, but at the time, the idea of taking projection and making it mobile, having a system for doing that, taking it on the road, outdoors, into public environments, and projecting at a scale was quite an innovative strategy. Or Steve DeRee, who is working on, in this particular instance, and Steve is still actually teaching at the CADRE Laboratory now, professor there. Steve, in this project, was exploring Silicon Valley commuting, and like Southern California, the commutes are deadly here in the Bay Area. So what he had done was to take his old car and took the steering wheel and strapped it over to the right as far as it would go and tied it down, took it into the gallery, reversed the driver's seat to face the passenger seat, put himself along with 3 other people in the car, filled it up with gas and turned it on. And they, in the gallery, would go around in circles for quite a long time as they would conduct commute activities such as playing games and baking bread and reading books. And the images were used simple wireless transmission to be represented in the gallery where the audience could view them, but also could be distributed over the internet. Collaboration was a huge big deal for us, and we began, we worked on a variety of projects as a community and as a group. One was the CADRE SV1 satellite. It was a hypothetical satellite that we had proposed under the guidelines for that NASA had established for private satellite development, and specifically for universities to submit proposals. This one had the design for a new computing architecture called the pataphysical computer processor that utilized a zero gravity environment to allow the processing units to be self-organizing in space as they needed to reconfigure themselves relative to a particular task. But on the right, we have what was the 4th CADRE conference, which was called the Chemistry of Fear. And this took place at the Fort Ord Military Chapel in Monterey. They let us have access to the chapel, and we had a public conference there to explore the relationship of fear to technology innovation. And we had a whole host of speakers come to speak on that topic, one of which was a fellow named Piero Scaruffi, who then went on to form the laser programs with Leonardo that have now prospered in over 45 countries around the world. So Piero's introduction to the art and technology world happened in that chapel on that day, talking about fear. This was a project that was developed with another colleague and myself, Matt Mays, called Entailment Mesh. It was based on the theoretical model developed by Gordon Pask and Paul Pangaro. Gordon Pask was a protege of Alan Turing, someone that I had an opportunity to meet when I was at MIT. He was a conversational and learning systems specialist, specializing in linguistics. They had developed a program called Do What Do, which was a concept that was intended to allow computers to communicate in conversation with one another, to emerge conversations and knowledge about things that they needed. None of the individual expert systems resident on the machines had knowledge of. So an easy way of explaining it is to say if one device knows everything about engines, another device knows everything about speed, another device knows everything about leather. Put into conversational mode, they will emerge a conversation about motorcycles. In this instance, we took old Palm Pilots. They weren't old at the time, they were new at the time. And we used the Do What Do methodology to develop a system that would allow the Palm Pilots to learn from the conversation that was taking place between individuals exchanging text messages, and to use the learning methodology, the conversational methodology, to evolve what they think would be said next and the context in which it would be said in. So it basically became a facilitator. We weren't thinking at the time about AI. We weren't thinking about at the time about learning systems, machine learning systems. We were just making cool stuff. And this was a cool thing to do. But as you can see, it pointed to a future that was coming down the road. This is a project called Telepresence Surveillance. It was about using 3 robots that had flocking algorithms that allowed them to coordinate their motion and movement with one another, a bit like herding dogs. And the idea was to turn them loose inside of architectures that they would then be able to explore those architectures on their own. And if people came into those spaces, they would know how to interact with and basically manipulate the individuals if they came into the room by gathering around them and shepherding them into specific locations in their architecture. And this was a early exploration of this kind of robotics, but it was also a way of looking at how to use wireless communications with robots to collect imagery live that could be streamed over the internet. And this is streaming over the internet was a new thing at the time. A very ambitious project done by the laboratory was called Conduits. It was based on a model that I had developed while I was a Xerox PARC artist in residence, to design a machine that had one purpose, and that the purpose was to translate what you say to it into what you mean. And we proposed to the city of Palo Alto, and actually they invited us, to stage a media spectacle at their city hall building for their centennial celebration. So we literally built this machine on site that would do what I said. It would translate what someone tells it into what one means. And then we invited individuals from all over Silicon Valley to come and yell at the machine and have it do its function. This was done as a performance in which the city hall representatives and the mayor were sequestered inside City Hall during the performance, so they couldn't see what was going on. But the goal was to establish the largest public media disaster that Palo Alto had ever seen, so that we could then demonstrate all the resources that the city had to contend with that, which included hazmat teams on site, rescuing the audiences and performers, but also a SWAT team that repels off the building into the space to put an end to the event. It was quite the spectacle, and I was not allowed in Palo Alto for a number of years. It's gotten better. A very cool project was this. It was simple, but it was really quite elegant. And this is the Silicon Valley Golf Classic. It was a par 1 golf course that we staged on Silicon Valley campuses. So Adobe, Microsoft, Applied Materials, Google, etc. We would show up with golf clubs and golf balls in hand, with tech messages written on the golf balls, and then we'd hit the golf balls at the buildings. It was simple, but to the point. Or this also a very large scale project called the Wedding Game, where I had a kind of fantasy about putting a rock band together and performing in Las Vegas, but I don't really have that much talent. So I gathered together a bunch of several other people who also did not have talent. We formed a rock band, and then we created this thing called the Wedding Game, which was a staged as a pilot for a television show about weddings in unusual places. And we actually had someone get married on site so that we could perform. But what was cool was the site was the Las Vegas Motor Speedway, which is one of the largest racetracks in the country, seats over 100,000 people. We probably had 10 people. But nevertheless, it was in this incredible environment with race cars going around us, conducting time trials and so on. and allowed the band to perform for 2 hours, which was the most exciting thing I'd done in quite some time. We went on to produce an album that anybody's interested in get in contact with me. And Brett, I'm sure, remembers this project well, called the Landscape Painting and Counter Surveillance of Area 51, where we posed as landscape painters and arrived at the perimeter of Area 51 to paint, and as an action of viewing what was on the other side of this invisible demarcation boundary that separated the public land from the Area 51, which is the Nellis Air Force Base. The paintings were then sold. They were put on display at the Area 51 Research Center, which is a trailer alongside the highway. All the paintings were sold, except for 2, which were absconded with from the guy who ran the trailer. We've yet to recover those. But the project was a very interesting exploration of surveillance. The military was keenly aware of our presence there and monitored our activities very, very carefully so that we did not transgress onto the government land, which is a highly secure research facility, which has this mythology of the Area 51 built up around it. And so this was important because this project has become part of the legacy of the Area 51 mythos. And this project is the rocket launch at Panama Launch, which is similar, somewhat in nature to the Area 51 project in that it borders the U.S. Naval Weapons Rocket Research Center in Death Valley. We positioned ourselves adjacent to the boundary and conducted an all-day rocket launch into the military space. The rockets were art rockets, each one custom designed by a participating artist. And in this case, the rocket I produced was 4 rockets actually attached to a pole by thin, fine wire. So they would enter and exit the intention was they'd enter and exit the military space, but they'd also form an elaborate complex trajectory as they moved about the pole. It was May Day, so it was an appropriate kind of celebration for that event. And you can see people hiding behind the rocks. Brett's up there somewhere, avoiding getting hit by an errant rocket. So all this is part of this pathway of cadre, and about this time in that this is in the mid '90s, in the '90s, all that early equipment that we had, which was useless, we pulled it back together and worked and repurposed it so that it would be focused around this idea that I had of doing taking the presidential portraits from the National Gallery and doing a facial analysis of the portraits to develop a predictive algorithm to basically predict the appearance of the next president. And it kind of worked, but not, because in the end, it predicts old white guys. And we actually ultimately ended up not getting an old white guy, but yeah, very interesting. So that's a little short overview of cadre. But one of the things that I was able to do with cadre was in I think 1997, I invited some of the alumni of grad alumni from cadre to join me in a project called the C5 Corporation. And C5 Corporation was a legitimate LLC in the state of Delaware, where we could get it established. It was intended to be an artwork as in the form of a Silicon Valley business startup. And so we tried to our best behave that way, both in terms of organization, but also spirit. The C5 was very intentionally tried to operate at that sweet spot in art, business, and research practice. We wanted to be taken seriously in both the museum, but also in the boardroom. And the primary focus of C5 was around data visualization, mapping technologies, navigation, and networks. And we did some pretty incredible work over a 10-year period that we were able to keep the group actively engaged. You know, members would come and go, but a core group, you know, sustained sustained C5 for almost 10 years. And this is one example of one of the projects that we developed called SoftSub. SoftSub was a screensaver that would be resident on your computer. And what it did was that it would basically data mine your hard drive and take a very deep dive look at your file system structures to create a portrait of both your hard drive and your desktop organizational design style. And those are represented by what we here in this case, what we call icebergs. You can see on the left is the desktop of this particular machine, and on the right is its hard drive. So we looked at about 40 or so different characteristics, file names, file lengths, file types, et cetera, and using that information after it completed the survey of a specific machine, it would upload the results to C5, and C5 could then do comparative analysis of that machine relative to other users. And you could quickly begin to see where your organizational systems approach fit with that of others. And whether, say in my case, I'm a flat organizer, I'm not a hierarchical organizer. Everything I have is on the desktop. If I were to show you my machine right now, I have literally scores of files across my desktop. They don't fit onto the screen. They just stack up in a huge mess. It looks very much like my office. Whereas others, have a much tighter organizational strategy where, their file folder relationships are done in a much more organized way. Now, this is a pretty cool thing because with this tool, it would make available potential applications such as file sharing between machines of like characteristics. So I could say, well, go out and look at all the other users, and anyone that's close to the way in which I'm organizing things, share all my music files. Or another approach might be to say, well, I really like the way Bill Gates organizes his machine, make my machine look like his machine. So those were some of the ideas that were driving what we were doing. One of the largest projects C5 worked on was something called the landscape initiatives. This is one example called the analogous landscape. But the landscape initiatives involved really taking a hard look at the way in which we both navigate and map the landscape. And it was certainly informed by much work going on in the land art movement and conceptual art movement. But there were 3 projects. The 2 others were the Perfect View, which was a 10,000-mile motorcycle journey around the United States to locate geocached sites of the sublime and to photograph those sites. And third project was called The Other Path, which was to do a traverse of the Great Wall of China and then to remap that Great Wall into the state of California, where it would have been built, had it been built in the topographical character of California. All this used digital elevation mapping technology that gathered by satellites in the space shuttle to map the Earth's surface. And this particular project is called the analogous landscape, which was the design was to climb high altitude volcanoes, develop an algorithm that would help guide the hiker through those terrains based on the performance of the hiker in the previous terrain. So again, it was a kind of machine learning strategy, although we weren't using those terms, to develop software that would help guide one through an environment based on their performance behavior in an environment of similar characteristics. And what you see here are two mountains that we climbed, Mount Shasta and Mount Fuji. And the graphics on the wall show the performance of the climbers in real time. All of this was complemented by something called the C5 media player, which each of the climbers would have a PDA device with them that can monitor their position and location using GPS. And they would be able to collect photographs, text, send text, message, record notes, etc., collect sound, and assign it to the specific location. This was a very early idea about using media in this way. And obviously things have matured significantly in the mapping space that we're all familiar with today. But this was, an early experiment in that kind of technology. So all this led, simultaneously into this relationship at ZERO1, the CADRE conferences, the artist visiting artist programs, the relationship that the reputation that C5 had established. In 2008, I took on the executive directorship of ZERO1. And the ambition of ZERO1 was to stage an international contemporary art biennale in Silicon Valley. In fact, we were able to do that. We did it 3 times. Over those 3 iterations, we featured 600 artists from 45 countries. We were one of the largest commissioning agencies in the United States, bringing world-class artists from all over who are working in this interface between art, science, and technology. This is a very large-scale projection mapping of the Richard Meyer Architecture Building, City Hall in San Jose that created using high-resolution projectors staged in and around the environment to transform the environment in real time through algorithms that were morphing the building architecture. And literally people would be driving, thousands of people would be driving by this at night to view it. Eduardo Koch, a project of his called Aroma Poetry, where he was using a kind of nanotechnology-like process to embed the surface of pages with smell that would be a catalyst for the viewer to connect that smell with past experience. And it was surprisingly accurate in how it operates. The pages are activated by their turning, it's not a scratch and sniff type technology, but literally the molecules in the pages are activated when you turn them. They generate the olfactory character of the smell, and the smells were very consistent. So you'd say, well, it was like that was the backyard of grandma's house after a rain. it was quite specific. And there are only 4 of these books made. Eduardo has placed those in museums and collections. Shuli Chang, another world-class artist, had a project where she invited the public to come in and cannibalize over 300 keyboards and to extract the keys off the keyboards, and stripping them down to their substrates. And then she built an electronic music instrument that could be performed by audiences as they would pick up keys and reassign them to locations on this keyboard matrix. And by doing so, each of those locations would activate pre-recorded sound, and the instrument was reconfigurable in real time. So it was a pretty amazing piece. There's another example of we commissioned a number of projects like this, but this was one of my favorites, called by Blastery from the UK, called Machine to See With, which was a participatory cinema in which audience members become actors and are monitored by observers who are putting their observations online. And so you received all your instructions as an actor via cell phone. It might say, hey, go to the bus station, sit down next to that person with a hat, give them a hug, kiss them, or take their briefcase, or it could be any variety of things. But it would build the plot would be built through this communications through cell phone to the actors, of which you could sign up to participate and be an actor during that day. Not knowing, of course, what the scope was. And it ended up being a kind of Silicon Valley conspiracy mystery. Or Adam Brown and Robert Root Bernstein commissioned this work, which was a recreation of an experiment toward the origins of life using amino acids, where they built a system of hand-blown glass and specific chemical reacting agents and catalysts in these vessels to recreate the conditions in which life emerged. And this experiment was intended to see if amino acids could be conjured into sustaining themselves. This was an early experiments in the origins of life that they borrowed from science and recreated the experiment and allowed it to run continuously for a period of time to see what its behavior would be. And the answer is no, it did not create life, but it did create a lot of weird behavior of the amino acids. As an emeritus professor, I continue to do my own work. This is a quick, I'll go through this very quickly. A project called Drive, in which I drove across the United States using Google Maps, sitting at a table in a gallery in North Carolina, pushing myself with the cursor across the roads of America as an exploration of the mapping technologies that are used to represent those terrains. And as you can see on the right, you can see where the two terrains kind of meet, two maps meet together, where they sort of blur together. It was one of the revelations of the experience of this drive, was to see where the resolution of mapping across the country was more resolved and less resolved. Turns out that Arkansas is very resolved, but California not so much. And along the way of that trip, I produced about 500 photographs from the location and the view of the car that were then accessible in the gallery. Another project is called Citizen Sticks, which is an audience interactive system that allows for the audience members to express opinions about what they're experiencing or seeing and communicate those experiences using a stick with an LED red, green, blue light attached to its end, and using both machine learning and image processing to look at the auditorium or the environment where individuals are interacting, and to do real-time data analysis and feedback, so you can see and influence the behaviors and opinions of others. Brett mentioned the exhibition I curated recently, a year or so ago at SLAC at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. 50 artists. This is the mobile research platform group where they restaged the lunar landing on the moon in the gallery. It was pretty cool. And I'm currently working with Jonathan Keats, who's a visiting artist at CADRE, on something called the Democracy Engine, which is an attempt to build an electromechanical system that could potentially replace the US legislature in terms of voting, and to be used as a simulator for testing policy initiatives. And so we're in the middle of that. And this past year I was at Stanford University as a visiting professor, visiting artist in the med school. And what I was doing there was working with postgraduates, playing with and exploring personal drones. I won't go into the details of that. The last thing I want to share with you is what I'm working on right now, and it's with my partner Lisa Johansson, called the L&J Ranch. And this is going to be another one of these 10-year or so projects, and the basic idea is that it's the new umbrella that I'm using to conduct research, do projects, but primarily work that is focused around land use and this idea of sense of place. If you don't recognize this, it was a fission reactor experiment, and that's still in the landscape of North Dakota. And at the National Lab there, obviously non-functional, but the early work they did there was sort of abandoned. But this idea of exploring this relationship between place and the life that it enables, meaning that every place is challenged by the way in which land is part of the equation of survival. And we're primarily interested in the rural landscape and looking at the way in which individual interactions with that landscape have shaped the identities and stories of the people who are making their lives there. This past year, right before COVID, we took about 11,000 mile trip across the US to investigate various sites in a project called Miles of America. We looked at over 20 specific sites that ranged from, as you can see here, fracking wells in North Dakota, of which there are hundreds and hundreds of these that are across the landscape that have completely transformed the identity of that place and the people who live and work there. This is the Beast nuclear reactor, one of the oldest nuclear reactors in the US, located on the shores of Lake Erie, in which we were literally able to drive right up to it, virtually next to it, and could have thrown a rock and hit it almost before we were intercepted. But one of the reasons for being there is that this is a reactor that has leakage problems, has for quite some time. It's an antiquated infrastructure that empties into the heat from the water empties into Lake Erie, and radioactivity has been slowly but surely part of the challenge of how to mediate that environmental disaster that's been looming there for years. So these are the kinds of places that we've been exploring. We're currently developing this thing called the Antenna Project, which is a mobile research laboratory / variable media production studio. And we're going to be taking this on the road in September, starting in New Mexico to do some work along the Gila River, which is one of the most endangered tributaries in the United States, and the entire watershed of southwestern New Mexico. And we'll be staging a project on a ranch of a colleague of ours and friend, Russell Smith, who the Gila River runs through his property and he controls the water rights too. But it's a contentious place of environmentalism versus ranching. And we'll be producing a project on site there, looking at his and the community's relationship to that watershed. The two other sites that we're working with are Baker City in Oregon, which has a Chinese cemetery, old Chinese cemetery, abandoned, that has one individual in it. And that's a fellow named Li Chu. All the other corpses from the cemetery were exhumed and sent back to China during the anti-Sino political era of the United States. Li Chu was the only person that was left. The cemetery, the exhumed holes and pits are still there. You can walk through them. And the question became, who is this person and what happened to the Chinese equation as it related to this part of remote Oregon, because the Chinese were such an important part of the evolution of the infrastructure of that area of the country. And the third environment is Butte, Montana, which has the largest Superfund site in the United States, which is the Berkeley Pit, which is a quite incredible large water mass located virtually downtown Butte. Looks a bit like a Lake Tahoe, and has a severe sulfuric acid problem as a result of the surface mining that takes place in and around that area, and has for years. But the town itself, it was the locus of the labor movement in the early part of the 20th century, as part of the, as miners were beginning to organize and protect themselves against these very large corporations. Today, Arco Corporation is responsible for the cleanup of this site, which is virtually impossible to do because of its scale. And the only thing that can be done is the mediation of it. At this point in time, it's not a whole lot more than a tourist attraction. So that's the trajectory. And I really, I want to say right from here is that I really appreciate the indulgence. Or you're indulging me. I skimmed as fast as I could through all of these things. And like I said from the beginning, each of them has a story behind itself. And I know that in doing the presentation this way, I'm sure it leaves many questions. So, well, what was that about? Or what was that specific thing? And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. But really, the impression I wanted to leave you with was again, this trajectory, this path of this relationship of art to computing to culture. And, CADRE isn't all things to all people, but it did lay out and open the portal to many individuals to go through to begin to figure out for themselves, where and how they wanted to impact the world. So it's something I'm very proud of, and so I'll stop there and let me jump out of the screen sharing here, and Brett, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Joel. This was also for me a trip down memory lane, but also filling in some parts of the legacy of CADRE that I was less familiar with. So I'm even more convinced of the value of what you and other people managed to do there. So, just in sort of thinking, I have a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to students in the class to talk about this. But one of them is, you mentioned earlier, and this is something I think could be really, really important for the class. You mentioned this process of sort of unlearning that is central to CADRE. I wondered if maybe you could expand on that a little bit in today's computing in the arts world context, because at any moment in the history of computing in the arts, there's some, maybe technological and also thematic obsessions that rise to the top and guide people through the field in one way or another. And in my generation, it was the internet and net art was one of the things that really informed a lot of people's careers, computer games being another one. So, there are ways that we think about these media that are a lot more received than they are. There's some notion of what we should do with this media. And, at MIT, at CADRE, here at UCSD and the ICAM major, one of the things we're really interested in doing is overcoming that and maybe exploring the things that are possible with technologies, but that the inventors of the technologies didn't intend them to be used for. And I just wonder if you have any more thoughts about, how you unlearn technology, how we unlearn what is received as artists.
Well, in some ways, Brett, you answered your own question. But
I do that sometimes, yeah.
But I guess, just to comment on it a bit further is that I think the problem really is in education generally, in that education tends to indoctrinate people into particular ways of thinking in particular disciplines. And of course, that's good in some cases. You want to have, full expertise in certain areas that's reliable and dependable and trustworthy. And, I want my neurosurgeon to know what they're doing. I don't want them guessing, if I had a neurosurgeon. On the other hand, there needs to be some open terrain there for kind of unbridled experimentation to take place that emerges from folks who don't necessarily fit so conveniently into these more traditional strategies of learning and of professional practice. And so I think, some environments, CADRE, maybe UCSD and others, I think there's a host of them, try to create environments that encourage students to be rule breakers, to be, to not take it all for granted, and to consistently challenge themselves to violate the perspectives that they've been taught. And in art school, I think it's a particular problem, a severe problem, I would say, because, students are indoctrinated in art school in a very, still to this day, very modernist traditions that view the artist in a very particular way. And view the role and function of art in very particular ways. And so, I think as teachers, teacher collaborators, one of the things that we can do is to help students feel comfortable violating those ideas that they were taught, and to be brave enough to sort of tackle other ways of thinking. Now, that's not going to necessarily push people completely out of the paradigms they operate in. It's like, there's a good reason for exploring gaming, and a good reason for net art. But after a period of time, those things also become institutionalized behaviors with expectations around them that have to be violated. So yeah. Back to you.
Sorry, Professor.
Sorry.
I think I muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I unmute. I did not unmute. I do that once a class. It's kind of a tradition. So kind of also another kind of question that one of the things I wanted to say about what you just said is that we have a colleague in the Department of Visual Arts, Professor Michael Trujillo, and one of the things that he regularly tells undergraduates that I think kind of summarizes this a little bit is, to disappoint your parents, students. That's maybe the best way to approach art making right now. Okay, so the question about
disappoint them by being an artist, or disappoint them by the way you make art?
I think both. Yeah.
Both, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things you're working on right now is the L&J Ranch project, which has to do with, thinking through both histories of places, the experience of being in place, and in particular, kind of using remote places in the country as kind of art supplies, nexus of focus, and other things. And I'm wondering this is obviously related to some traditions in the art, of course, landscape painting through land art, through computationally mediated landscape kind of work that C5, I believe, was an innovator in. Where are we now? What kind of other researchers out there do you see who are kind of engaging remote location in interesting ways? And what are your thoughts about like working through it at this particular time in the technological context that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you're correct, and that a lot, the work I'm currently involved with, that the work of C5 was shaped and influenced by two things primarily. The land art work of many predecessors, from folks like, say, Richard Long to Michael Heiser to Smithson, but also just generally the conceptual art movement as a way of thinking about how organizational systems influence the way, the strategies of the approach of using organizational systems as the art form itself, and in terms of strategy, approach, etc. And so, those are kind of baselines. But then, obviously the technologies of mapping and navigation, big data, have converged in ways that are reshaping the very conceptualization of what we mean by the term landscape, the way in which borders are dissolved or thought about, the way in which they operate. When we talk about navigation, it's no longer about getting from here to there. It's about a kind of nonlinear path one takes in the process of conceptualizing where they are. And so, I think there's a lot of research still to be done in figuring this stuff out. For the L&J Ranch, we've, it's complicated. I said we're creating this mobile research laboratory that uses our Airstream trailer as a kind of way to enter into those spaces. But what we're taking with us is a whole variety of tools and technologies. So part of the idea is that we want to be able to use narrowcast bandwidth broadcasting, pirate television, to reach very, very small communities. Maybe one person, maybe nobody. And to be able to do live transmission that way, the old way, to reclaim the airwave, to to insert oneself into these local environments in a local way, very, very local way. But at the same time, recognizing that there are audiences to also communicate with and interact with that may interface with the projects in other ways. So one of the things that we're doing is staging. We'll be staging the work as a kind of live studio / exhibition where we can present the ongoing research that we'll be conducting, the investigative research of the environment, using tools including drones and microscopes and looking at the big and the small, and but also investigative reporting in terms of doing interviews and both live and recorded and sharing those. But we also plan to be cooking and having meals with people and sharing and bringing folks together over food and drink to talk about, and in some cases maybe resolve challenges that they're facing that can't be resolved at the policy level. Playing music together, those sorts of social activities. And so when we look at the L&J Ranch, I'm only using this as a kind of model, and because you asked about the kind of research or practice that people are undertaking, you kind of look at it in that scope. It's this kind of intersection of a kind of social interventionism, social justice work that's also engaged in narrative construction, storytelling, which is, variable media platforms. You almost, these kinds of works become more like a channel than a project. And so, I think that's where the meat is on the bone right now for a lot of artists, is to figure out is that, in the contemporary scheme of things, we have channels. We don't have things. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, students, it's your turn to ask Professor Slayton questions. So I'm going to throw the floor open. How this will work is I'll look for you to raise your hand, and please do. And I will call on you by first name. Eileen has a question.
Hi, Professor Slayton. So I would like to ask a question. As a student, I'm really concerned that what was your motivation of your career path during your student life that leads you to the ICAM path?
Yes, Eileen, it's a good question. I was in the right place at the right time with the right people. A lot of it was just luck. I mean, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to go to law school. I thought that's what I should do. I was quite interested in politics, and I didn't want to be like a trial attorney or anything like that, but I did want to be involved in policy making, and so I thought that's where I'd end up. Along the way, like many folks, I am one that changed my whole worldview. In my case, it was a guy named Jim Friedman. He was a photographer. I decided to take a photo class in college, something I was always interested in and did on the side in my own way, but I also had a deep interest in science and technology and just in general. I like to take things apart and put them back together again, so, and I found myself in this, and the reason I bring him up is that he taught me something that was, sticks with me to this day. He said, at the time we were talking about cameras, and he was like, the camera is a weapon. And I was like, what? The camera's a weapon. And the camera is your license to go, insert yourself into the world in the most complicated way you can find. And I guess it's like a light bulb went off, and that changed everything for me. So from there, I really kind of dedicated myself to that, trying to insert myself into the world in complex ways. And then from there, it was like this person introduced me to that person, introduced me to that person. I was lucky enough to after graduate school be invited to come to MIT and hang out there as sort of postgraduate study for a while. And I met lots of really, influential, strange, misfit people who helped shape, how I saw the world. But it's like all things. I guess I'm not a big believer in that you have to have a goal, that you're working towards to get to where you want to be. You just gotta follow your nose. Not a very good answer, Eileen. I'm sorry, but it's the truth.
It is something that's come up a lot in this class. Yes. Oh, Eileen, go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's really motivated because I was about to do a total different thing rather than art. And also like someone kind of talked to me and changed my ideas. I changed my major goals in my senior year in high school. So that was pretty late, but I think I made a good choice. I think I grabbed my chance too.
Well, I hope the best for you. I mean, make art. Making art's great. I can't imagine having something more luxurious to do.
Among the things that we've discussed this quarter are sort of issues of the artist lifestyle, what you do immediately after graduation, what led people into the fields. To summarize a little bit, one of the more interesting ones is that Cicero Silva ends up in this field because as a kid, he just liked technology, and he would go from Brazil, where technology was expensive, to Paraguay to, purchase inexpensive computers and bring them back to work on them. And, he just developed that interest as a young person, never really intended to be in either the world of communications or digital media, new media art, computing in the arts, whatever we call it. So more student questions, please.
I was thinking about that place. I forgot its name. It took place in the city hall, I believe. It's about a machine that follows vocal commands, was it?
The projection or the
I think he means the Palo Alto project.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
What exactly went wrong that caused the SWAT team or like the emergency crews to just barge in there and say like, oh shoot, this is #1 emergency?
Yeah. When at the beginning I said, oh man, some of these things have big stories. That's one that has a big story. So I intentionally staged the event to be a spectacle, a performance, outdoor performance, to be a spectacle. It had, I enlisted the participation of, opera singers and everything from Boy Scouts to opera singers to the SWAT team to, the fire department. I had, any city service I could get my hands on. that they would agree to let me incorporate into the performance, I took. And the idea was to stage an event where the machine, we called it the C machine, would do what I described. It would take what you say to it and translate it into what you mean. But the problem was Palo Alto has this incredibly racist past. And it represents itself in the contemporary hubris of the city as this like incredibly liberal place, you know, the home of Stanford University, the intellectual seat of Silicon Valley. Its politics are you know, are liberal. They debate every single possible thing that could ever, you know, get through a policy decision at City Hall. And yet, as I dug through the research of Palo Alto's past, I uncovered all kinds of behavior on the part of the city that was pretty atrocious, and in this case, you know, quite racist. The segregation of communities with their intentional zoning and housing, the way in which businesses were run to exclude diversity, you know, very intentional stuff. And so one of the things that we did in the performance was, as people were, you know, speaking to the machine, which was sending the messages to Palo Alto's sister cities around the world, the messages would sort of reflect back on that history and retranslate what people were saying into exposing that history to the world. And it didn't go over well. And you know, the mayor and the city hall, I mean, people were quite upset about what was taking place live, you know, on site. And I knew this was going to happen. Actually, the people who had commissioned the show knew what was going to happen. And we staged it in such a way that the mayor comes out and goes on stage and calls for an end of the show. You know, just let's stop this thing now. You know, we, the city of Palo Alto, are calling an end to this Joel Slayton madness show. And at that time, I had a helicopter fly in overhead, set off a set of strobes. And from there, I had the SWAT team rappel into the City Hall environment stage with their weapons drawn, dropping acoustic hand grenades. It was really scary stuff. And simultaneously had the hazmat teams on site hosing down the site, and had the fire department putting performers in ambulances and racing them off. It looked like it was an intentional disaster simulation, but it was a public relations disaster. It wasn't a real disaster. It was just a public relations disaster. And so all of this was sort of conceptualized in the artwork, but the public was unaware. They didn't know. All they knew was what they were experiencing and seeing. And yeah, so I mean, that was the flavor of the thing. And the city filed a lawsuit against me, you know, which was quickly dismissed. But you know, there was lots of bad press about how awful a person I was.
Well done. Well done.
I apologize for what just happened. Who was that guy who had the racist past? We called him Paul?
No, it wasn't a particular person. It wasn't one person. It was the racism was systemic in Palo Alto's history.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, well done. It's really a remarkable project.
I know. By the way, let me say, that's not unique to Palo Alto. You know, it's true in communities all over the country. I don't want to just single them out and say, oh, well, just them. You know, most communities in the hubris and promoting themselves cover up their past. Baker City in Oregon, the place that we're working on that I mentioned with the Chinese cemetery, very similar thing. There used to be a very robust Chinatown there, which has been erased. Is nothing there at all. They completely removed every trace of it, except for a couple small little architectural blunders that I discovered, in this guy's grave. So, I mean, these cities communities are very good at self-promotion to cover up their past. Sorry, Brett, I didn't mean to.
No, thank you. There's a question in chat. Taro is asking, he didn't understand, you said art school has a problem right now, and could you talk more about the problems of art schools? And that, makes me think a lot about the process that we go through in terms of designing curriculum, thinking about what we teach in an art program at UC San Diego. You have vast experience in sort of imagining what a curriculum should be, what a curriculum should look like. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit and maybe talk about, what you see as, if you see any solutions, talk about what they are.
Yeah. Well, the problem that I was referring to in art school is the narrowness of the modernist tradition of art as the dominant model, and meaning teaching students that it's about individual expression, that they are somehow, if they do it the right way, they become visionary, and that it's best done from an intuitive, place. And I mean, that's way oversimplifying it, but that the attitude that's built, that gets indoctrinated into students in their very early core curriculum courses by, grad students or professors, about what it means to be an artist, I think in many cases, in many schools, is pretty atrocious, but a bigger problem, in my view, is that it reserves the big challenges, the big questions are put aside, and they're not, and students in the early learning processes of their careers are not introduced and included in addressing those really complex questions about society, culture, the politics, the economics of our reality, our shared reality. And I think that, obviously there's a lot of recognition that that's a problem. A lot of people are doing work about it, and in their individual courses and so on. But curriculum in general, when you look at the guidelines from national accrediting organizations that are put on schools so they receive accreditation, they're often very, very traditional. And I think that's problematic. So that's one piece. The other thing that I would you asked about, ideas about curricular stuff, that I personally am just a firm believer in that there should not be a standard curriculum, because people are not the same. From my perspective, individuals need to be able to customize their educational experience to meet their needs, to meet their desires, to allow them the flexibility that in 2022 to structure a learning process that allows them to intersect in the most flexible, transdisciplinary way that they can with the academic environment and resources that are available to them. And at CADRE, at least, I tried very early on to ensure that every student had that opportunity to customize their coursework. In fact, I went to the extent of saying, there are only 2 courses that we teach in the cadre program at the undergraduate level. 2, period. And so that experience lasted for 1 year. And then from there you went into, independent studies, et cetera, et cetera. But the major required that every student do upper division study in one other department outside of art school, outside of art and design, or art history. And so students would come, with programs that intersected with philosophy, with meteorology, with computer science, with math, with business, political science. I mean, so many different intersecting points, and they had to perform well in order to be accepted into the upper division courses in those departments. I mean, they had to get accepted in those departments. In other words, they had to be part of those communities as well as the cadre community, and then bring that experience back to the laboratory and share it, and use it to help others learn about ideas that were emerging from other locations within the university environment. I found that to be very impactful and an important way to go about it. I think the complications get in, and of course, at the time when I was running that program, we had a very small core constituency of students. It wasn't very large. Once you get up into the hundreds of students, it becomes a management problem, and that's when things start to require institutionalized strategies that adhere to all the BS that universities put on professors and make them do what they think they should be doing. Something like that.
Okay, dear students, let's have another question. Somebody just jump in there, please. Okay, I do believe we possibly have a question coming from out of the YouTube stream, and that's in the process of coming in. So let me ask something else, Joel, just sort of about kind of what's important to learn in the field. You mentioned earlier that one of the important principles in the cadre major was that everybody programs, everybody can code. Was really, really important. Do you want to explain to students why that is, what your thinking was about that at that time?
Yeah, I can explain what my thinking was at that time, and maybe even what my thinking is about it today. Just shifted a little bit. At the time, computers didn't do very much. In the beginning, 1984, you got to remember. I mean, I drove up to San Jose State with a carload of Commodore 64 computers in my trunk with 300 baud modems, and that's what I had. That was it, and that was like, wow, this is amazing, And I showed you the picture of the Ridge RISC Unix machine. That was amazing. To be able to jump from Commodore 64s to this Unix environment. I thought I was back at MIT again. But the bottom line was the stuff didn't do very much. And if you wanted to do anything interesting at all, you had to learn to code. There was just no way around it. Of course, as personal computers were introduced and application software started to become more available, and all of those things started to make it easier and more, I guess, democratic in some ways, the access to creative tools that could be used with computers. I mean, that's a positive thing in one hand, but on the other hand, you could only make what you were allowed to make. you can only produce what was possible to produce within those systems. And I always felt that it was, it was important to be able to manipulate and build the tools that you want to build to do the things you want to do. That's one piece of it. The other piece is that is more of a kind of conceptual question, which has to do with computation itself, which is, being, to really explore this intersection of computation and the arts, understanding what's possible with computation and what is not possible with computation is pretty important. I mean, some things it's really, suited well for. But if you're going to start tackling issues like AI, for example, you have to have a much more solid grounding in computing theory, information theory, understanding complexity, complex systems, data and data analytics. I mean, these things become really critical parts of the vocabulary and intelligence of an individual to be able to begin to even tackle, some of the things that they might want to be able to do or explore in those domains. And so for me, I think that was just absolutely critical that be core to the experience, and that this bridge of doing the artist as researcher, the artist, I mean, that's a very important concept as well. The artist as researcher, the artist as experimenter, both theoretically and pragmatically, practically, the bridge between all of those things. And if you wanted to be a provocateur, you needed to learn how to code. And I would stand by that today. Things have changed, of course, and are likely to change dramatically in the coming years as we start to see the nature of coding morph into other forms of the process of coding. I mean, this way of using formal languages to build things with is slowly giving way to using informal languages for building things with, and machines that teach themselves to do, machines that teach and learn themselves to do what they do to allow you to do it with them. That's coming. And again, I think, artists need to be savvy enough to be able to play in those spaces. And that requires a certain level of technical knowledge and expertise. But as things unfold, knowing exactly what the fit is that, for you as an individual is going to be challenging, but it's also going to be necessary.
We have a question coming from the YouTube audience. One of our graduate students, Grace Grothis, is asking, she says, thank you for the excellent talk. In your curatorial work, what are some of the emerging threads or commonalities that you see many artists working across?
Well, is this Grace? Is that
Grace? Yeah.
Hey, Grace. Hi, Grace. Well, I'm going to kind of avoid the answer to that because I don't think it's so much about threads. I think the simple answer would be say, well, artists are doing installation work, they're doing performative work, they're doing visualization work, they're doing networks, they're working in gaming, they're robotics, VR, all of those things. And but I think conceptually, what I've been seeing more prevalent is that the artists themselves are intersecting with the world in different ways than they ever have before. Or not ever have, that's the wrong way to say it. They're intersecting with the world in more social ways than, 15, 20 years ago. And much of the work is informed by local context, of where the artist is operative and the environment in which they're being responsive to, and I think that's a real positive. It's like less work that sort of tries to be situated with kind of universal audiences or these really broad audiences, but works that are really intended for smaller, more localized audiences. And also means that the artists are bringing a kind of local expertise, context-specific expertise to the work that is unique, and and I think that's pretty interesting to look at. I was talking with the artist Fred Paulino from Gambologico in Sao Paulo just a few weeks ago, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Gambologico, but it's an amazing, how they use these like repurposed technologies to build useful, interesting things that are artworks, but they're also, necessary. and but they would only emerge within that kind of framework, and not something that you'd see here on the ground in Silicon Valley, just quite different. So I think localization is a big thing I see, in terms of a thread, I guess.
Here's something that I've been thinking about a lot in recent years is sort of the mainstreaming or normalization of kind of technologies that have been frequently explored in computing and the arts. As computation has sort of entered every corner of everything we do, normalized in daily life, you see a lot of artists who are either well established in their field, beginning to engage with computing in the arts kinds of media. And you also see kind of a return of the artist-engineer axis. Early in the history of computing in the arts, for example, like experiments with art and technology, the whole idea was to put artists together with engineers because it was presumed that the artists would bring some kind of creative spark and the engineers would bring the technical know-how. And there's been sort of a weaving experience, I guess, or between that throughout the history of computing in the arts. Sometimes it's isolated in that modernist individual who's sort of a programmer, master of the technology, and all the problems that you point to in modernism. At other times, it sort of separates, and you see a lot of works in the mainstream art world that are really kind of obviously naive about the technology. Almost like every year somebody reinvents, branching narrative, and every year somebody has the first exhibition in a virtual reality space, right? So how do you see those things, playing out in the near future, and where are we sort of along that artist-engineer axis right now?
Yeah, I think what you're pointing out is really true. Is that there's these things come in bubbles. So I was talking with Roger Molina just yesterday about this specific issue, and Roger's at UT Dallas. He's a distinguished professor there in their arts media science program, and executive editor at Leonardo. Somebody I've known for a very long time, and we're writing an article together, and this subject came up, and we were talking about these bubbles, like things seem to be reinvented or reiterated all the time, and he was sharing a story from about Gregory Kepish at MIT, and Kepish had come from the Bauhaus, of course, when Hitler ended the Bauhaus, and he ended up in Chicago, but he passed through Dallas, as it turns out, on his way to MIT to start the Center for Advanced Visual Studies. And in a conversation Roger was having with Kepish, he said something to the effect, it was like, where's the ping pong art when ping pong, just because you have these tools, is like, if you have ping pong, it doesn't necessarily mean you have ping pong art. And I thought that was pretty funny. But it led to this, or talking about these bubbles of innovation where, the VR narrative, which I showed an example of it in my talk there, VR piece done in the early days of VPL and Jaron Lanier's work with the Data Glove and Telepresence, and then NASA jumping on board and thinking, oh, we can do robotic surgeries, with astronauts on their way to Mars, and that's the kind of problem we were kind of exploring with them. Artists that were doing VR, these really complex technologies you had to wear, to do this kind of really, interaction. And then that just goes away. And then a few years later, Oculus, a few years later, blah, And so the stuff it comes in waves, and everyone always thinks, oh, that's, it's almost new, or it's been reinvented. And the fact of the matter is, things take time, and they take iteration. And the net art movement, had little attention or knowledge about all the telematic work that was done by other artists, using slow scan television and early networks,
Mail art. Yeah, exactly. And before that, other things. And so smoke signals, so we tend to think of that we're always at the leading edge of the technological, innovation. And it's not really true. What is true is that it takes particular people to, or groups of people, I would argue groups of people, to create the kinds of change in the world that are impactful and change the way we think about things. So I don't think it was Kepish at MIT. I do think it was the Center for Advanced Visual Studies. I don't think it was me at CADRE. I think it was the 100 graduate students who went through CADRE, including yourself, Brett, who have gone on to change the world. And we just can't lose sight of that fact. And I forgot your question, so I just started ranting and rambling. No, actually, I love the answer. Okay, so there's time for one more question, and we do have one more question that comes from the YouTube gallery. So let's make this the last one. It comes from Yusin Gao. And the question is, Professor Slayton, do you play video games? What games do you like?
No.
Yeah, same here.
I don't.
That was an easy one.
I have played video games, but no, I don't play them. And I don't use social media.
Yeah, I so much more, just personally, I really love to be out in the landscape as kind of a much better version of the kind of adventures that you might have in simulated spaces. And to me, it's much more interesting, the kinds of things you're doing right now, the antenna project, doing some local broadcasting, technological interventions in the landscape, installing solar powered remote artworks. Things like that, I think, are much more interesting than doing and exploring the world that's out there that's super interesting, rather than trying to reinvent it. And of course, there are complications to that. There are people to whom the world is not kind, who find great solace in virtual environments. So, of course, there's room for both kinds of work, but there is also a dynamic there.
I would never say anything like, oh, gaming's bad or something like that, or it's just that my puny little brain can only handle so much stuff. And the game that I'm playing, the game of the L&J Ranch, the game of C5, the game of ZERO1, the game of CADRE, those are games. They're big games, and they're, for me, they're consequential. They've got all the richness of what I imagine a game can be and should be, and so I'm interested in on that level, and I fully respect, the simulated realities and worlds in which people have to and choose to interact for a whole variety of reasons. As you know, Brett, we're now putting the CADRE archive together at San Jose State, and one of the things we're looking at is how does this exist in virtual space, so it can be shared more broadly and widely. And I'm being forced to think about these things, but my brain's not very big, so help.
Yeah, neither is mine. That's something we definitely share, dear Professor. Joel, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's remarkable to have an overview of that history. And it's just been wonderful to spend some time parsing your thoughts on all of these issues. I really, really appreciate it. And I know my students and the YouTube gallery also really appreciate it. Let's see virtual applause, the virtual clappy hands in Zoom for Professor Slayton.
Well, thank you.
That's a lot of virtual clappy hands right there. Excellent. Excellent.
When you do these things, it's like talking to yourself when you're looking at the screen,
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not a Zoom expert either. So
yeah, these have been strange times.
Strange times.
Okay, everybody, we are going to wrap the presentation part of this up. Thanks again, Joel. The class will continue. The YouTube stream is going to end, but the class will continue in just about 10 minutes, 15 after the hour. We will gather for our normal paper topic discussion session, because I know students are going to want to write a lot about things that have been thought about tonight. So thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye.